The dust cloud rising from the westbound stage caught Harrison Lambert's attention as he stepped out of the general store. A sack of flour balanced on his shoulder, and his heart lurched with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in the 6 weeks since he had sent that letter back east. The coach rattled into Fort Stanton, New Mexico, with its usual fanfare, and Harrison found himself rooted to the wooden boardwalk, watching as the driver pulled the horses to a halt outside the modest hotel that served as the town's main gathering place for travelers and locals alike. It was September of 1878, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the moment feel suspended in time. Harrison had not told anyone about the correspondence, about the advertisement he had answered in a Boston newspaper that his cousin had sent him months ago. At 32, he had resigned himself to a solitary existence on his cattle ranch 5 miles outside of town, figuring that no respectable woman would want to travel all the way to the New Mexico territory to marry a man she had never met. Yet here he stood, watching the stage door open, and his breath caught in his throat as a gloved hand appeared, followed by a woman in a traveling dress of deep blue that had seen better days but still maintained an air of dignity. Rebecca Sullivan stepped down from the coach with careful precision, her movements graceful despite the obvious exhaustion that marked her features. She was not what Harrison had expected, though he could not have said exactly what he had been anticipating. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face, while not conventionally beautiful in the way of magazine illustrations, held an intelligence and warmth that made his chest tighten. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with fine lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled often, though at this moment her expression was guarded and uncertain. But Harrison's attention was immediately drawn to the second figure emerging from the coach. An elderly woman, thin and frail, with silver hair and a face mapped with wrinkles that spoke of both hardship and laughter, took Rebecca's offered hand. The older woman moved slowly, wincing with each step, and Harrison could see the protective way Rebecca positioned herself, ready to catch her companion if she stumbled. "Mama, careful now," Rebecca said softly, her voice carrying across the street despite its gentle tone. "We are here. We made it." Harrison felt something shift inside his chest. The letters had never mentioned a mother. Rebecca had written about herself, about her teaching position in Boston that had ended when the school closed, about her desire for a new life and her hope that they might build something together based on mutual respect and kindness. She had been honest about her circumstances, or so he had thought, but this was an unexpected complication that would have given many men pause. He watched as Rebecca helped her mother to the boardwalk, as the driver tossed down 2 worn carpetbags and a small trunk that had seen better days. The older woman was breathing heavily, and even from this distance Harrison could see the slight bluish tint to her lips that spoke of a weak heart or troubled lungs. This was not a temporary visit. This was permanent. The station manager, a rotund man named Clyde who knew everyone's business, was already approaching the women. Harrison could not hear the exchange, but he saw Rebecca's shoulders stiffen, saw her chin lift in that universal gesture of defensive pride. She was explaining something, likely asking about lodging, and Clyde was shaking his head in that apologetic way that meant the hotel was full or that he had reservations about their ability to pay. Harrison made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. He set the flour sack down by the general store's door and crossed the street with long, purposeful strides. His boots kicked up small puffs of dust with each step, and he was aware of curious eyes following his progress. Fort Stanton was small enough that any unusual occurrence drew attention, and the arrival of 2 Eastern women would be the talk of the town for weeks. "Excuse me," Harrison said as he approached, removing his hat in a gesture his mother had drilled into him before she passed. "Miss Sullivan." Rebecca turned, and up close he could see that her eyes were a striking hazel, green and gold mixed together in a way that reminded him of the cottonwood trees along the creek in autumn. She studied him with an assessing gaze that held both hope and wariness. "Yes," she said. "I am Rebecca Sullivan. Are you Mr. Lambert?" "Harrison Lambert, yes, madam." He nodded, then turned his attention to the elderly woman who was leaning heavily on her daughter's arm. "And you must be Mrs. Sullivan. I am pleased to meet you both." The older woman's eyes, faded blue but still sharp, fixed on him. "Martha Sullivan," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I apologize for the surprise, Mr. Lambert. Rebecca wrote to tell you, but I suppose the letter did not arrive before we had to leave Boston." Harrison processed this information, filing away the admission for later consideration. Whatever had prompted their departure had been urgent enough that they could not wait for his response. That spoke of desperation, and desperation made people vulnerable in ways that Harrison instinctively wanted to protect against. "No letter arrived," he confirmed, keeping his voice neutral and kind. "But that does not change anything important. My home has room for both of you, if you are still willing to consider the arrangement we discussed." The relief that flooded Rebecca's face was so profound that Harrison felt his decision validated in that instant. She had been braced for rejection, had probably rehearsed a dozen different speeches defending her choice to bring her mother. The fact that he had not immediately turned away seemed to have caught her off guard. "You mean that?" Rebecca asked, and there was a tremor in her voice that she could not quite hide. "We would not be an imposition. I can work, Mr. Lambert. I can cook and clean and help with whatever needs doing. Mama can mend, and so despite her hands not being as steady as they once were, we will earn our keep. I am sure you will both be valuable additions to the household," Harrison said, and he meant it. "But first, let us get you settled and fed. You must be exhausted from the journey." Clyde, who had been watching this exchange with undisguised interest, cleared his throat. "You planning to marry right away then, Harrison? Reverend Morris is out visiting the Hendersons' ranch, but he will be back tomorrow." Harrison saw Rebecca's cheeks flush, saw the way Martha's eyes narrowed slightly at the station manager's presumptuousness. "That is a discussion for later," Harrison said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "Right now, these ladies need rest and a proper meal. I will take them out to the ranch." He collected their bags before either woman could protest, surprised by how light the trunk was. Everything they owned in the world, he realized, could fit in these few pieces of luggage. The weight of their trust in him, a stranger, settled over Harrison's shoulders with far more heft than any physical burden. His wagon was hitched outside the saloon, where he had stopped earlier to deliver a message to one of his ranch hands. As they walked the short distance, Harrison found himself acutely aware of the picture they must make. Him with his worn work clothes and sun-weathered face, leading 2 Boston women through the dusty streets of a frontier town that probably seemed primitive beyond belief to them. Yet neither woman complained or commented, and he appreciated their discretion. Harrison helped Martha into the wagon first, noting how she struggled to lift her legs high enough to manage the step. She was sicker than she had let on, he suspected, and the journey had taken a toll. Rebecca climbed up with more ease, settling beside her mother and immediately arranging their skirts to protect against the dust. "It is about 5 miles to the ranch," Harrison explained as he took his seat and picked up the reins. "The road is rough in places, but I will do my best to avoid the worst of it. There is water in the canteen under the seat if you need it." "Thank you," Rebecca said. "You are very kind, Mr. Lambert, more than we had any right to expect." As Harrison guided the horses out of town, he considered how to respond. The truth was that he had been lonely for longer than he cared to admit. The ranch kept him busy during the day, but the evenings stretched long and empty, and there was something soul-crushing about cooking meals for one and talking only to horses and cattle. He had convinced himself that he was content, that he did not need the complications that came with a wife and family, but Rebecca's letters had awakened something in him that he had thought long dormant. "I put an advertisement in that newspaper looking for a partner," Harrison said finally. "Someone to build a life with. The circumstances are not exactly what either of us anticipated, but the fundamental truth remains the same. I need someone, and you need somewhere to be. Seems to me we can help each other." Martha made a small sound that might have been approval, and Rebecca's hand found her mother's and squeezed. Harrison kept his eyes on the road, giving them a moment of privacy despite the close quarters. The landscape around Fort Stanton was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. The Capitan Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touched with the first hints of autumn snow, while the valleys were painted in shades of brown and gold, dotted with piñon and juniper trees that somehow thrived in the arid soil. Harrison loved this land with a fierceness that sometimes surprised him, loved its honesty and its challenges. It demanded everything from those who tried to make a life here, but it gave back in ways that were harder to quantify. Freedom. Space. The chance to be who you truly were without the weight of society's expectations. "It is very different from Boston," Rebecca observed, and Harrison could not tell if that was a complaint or simply a statement of fact. "It is," he agreed. "Takes some getting used to. But there is beauty here if you look for it. The sunsets are like nothing you have ever seen. And in spring, when the wildflowers bloom, the whole valley turns colors that do not seem real." "I like it," Martha said unexpectedly, her thin voice carrying conviction. "It feels like a place where a person could start over, where the past does not matter as much as what you do today." Harrison glanced at her, caught by the wistfulness in her tone. There was a story there, he sensed, layers of history that had brought these two women to his doorstep. But stories could wait. Right now, what mattered was getting them home and making them feel safe. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise, and Harrison tried to see it through their eyes. It was not much, just a simple structure of adobe and wood with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. He had built it himself 7 years ago when he had first claimed this land, adding to it gradually as his herd grew and his resources allowed. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a small bunkhouse for the 2 hands he employed during busy seasons, and a corral where several horses stood dozing in the late afternoon heat. "Home," Harrison said simply, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He helped both women down, again noting how unsteady Martha was on her feet. Inside, the house was clean but Spartan, furnished with pieces Harrison had made himself or acquired through trades in town. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace that would be essential when winter came. 2 bedrooms opened off the main space, and Harrison had already decided that he would give up his own room for the women and sleep in the bunkhouse until other arrangements could be made. "I know it is not fancy," Harrison said, setting their bags down by the door. "But it is solid and warm and dry. You will have the bedroom on the right. I will move my things out to the bunkhouse tonight." "Absolutely not," Rebecca said firmly, the first spark of fire showing in her demeanor. "We cannot displace you from your own room, Mr. Lambert. Mama and I will be perfectly comfortable in the smaller room. We have shared quarters before." Harrison started to argue, then saw the set of her jaw and recognized that this was important to her. Pride, he understood, was sometimes all a person had left. The smaller room, then, he conceded. But if you change your minds, the offer stands. Now, let me get a fire started and put some coffee on. I have stew from yesterday that I can heat up and bread that is only a day old. He busied himself with these tasks, aware that both women were taking in their surroundings with careful attention. The house reflected his bachelor existence in ways that were probably obvious to anyone with experience running a household. Everything was functional but minimal, lacking the touches that made a house a home. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no decorations or softness anywhere. Rebecca seemed to come to some internal decision. She removed her traveling jacket and hung it on one of the pegs by the door, then rolled up her sleeves in a businesslike manner. "Let me help," she said. "Where do you keep your plates and utensils?" "You do not need to do that," Harrison protested. "You just arrived. You should rest." "I have been sitting for days," Rebecca countered. "I would rather be useful. Please, Mr. Lambert, let me help." They worked together in the kitchen area, and Harrison found himself hyper-aware of her presence in his space. She moved with efficiency, asking questions about where things were stored and nodding when he explained his rudimentary system of organization. Within 30 minutes, the small table was set, and the stew was warming over the fire, filling the house with savory aromas that made Harrison realize how hungry he was. Martha had settled into the chair closest to the fireplace, and Harrison noticed that she was shivering slightly despite the warmth of the day. He grabbed a blanket from his room and draped it over her shoulders without comment, earning a grateful smile from Rebecca. They ate together as the sun set outside, painting the sky in those brilliant shades Harrison had promised. The conversation was stilted at first, all of them aware that they were essentially strangers thrust into an intimate situation. But gradually, as hunger was satisfied and the warmth of the fire and food worked their magic, the tension began to ease. Harrison learned that Martha had been a seamstress in Boston, that her husband had died 15 years earlier in an accident at the docks. Rebecca had been teaching at a small school for girls from poor families, a charity institution that had relied on donations to operate. When their primary benefactor died and his heirs chose not to continue his philanthropy, the school had closed with only a week's notice. Rebecca had been living in a boarding house, saving every penny in hopes of eventually having enough to open her own school, but the loss of her income had made that impossible. "And then Mama became ill," Rebecca said quietly, her eyes on her mother's face. "The doctors said she needed rest and fresh air, things that are impossible to find in the city when you have no money. I saw your cousin's advertisement in the newspaper someone had left at the boarding house. It seemed like Providence, a chance for both of us to start over." "So you wrote to me," Harrison said, understanding now the desperation that had driven her. "I wrote to you," Rebecca confirmed. "And you wrote back. Your letters were kind, Mr. Lambert. You seemed like a good man, someone who understood what it meant to work hard and to value honesty. I know this is not what you signed on for, bringing both of us. If you want us to leave, if this is too much, I will understand. We can go back to town and I will find some kind of work there." Harrison set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Miss Sullivan, I meant what I said earlier. My home has room for both of you. I'm not going to turn you away because circumstances are more complicated than I expected. Life is always more complicated than we expect. What matters is how we handle it." Martha spoke up then, her voice stronger than it had been. "You are a good man, Mr. Lambert. I can see why my daughter chose you, but I want you to know that I do not intend to be a burden. I can still be useful, even if my body does not cooperate the way it used to. And I will not stand in the way of whatever arrangement you and Rebecca come to. If you two decide to marry, I will make myself scarce and give you privacy." "Mama," Rebecca said, mortified, but Harrison held up a hand. "Mrs. Sullivan, you are not a burden. You are welcome here in whatever way makes sense for all of us." As for marriage, he looked at Rebecca, saw the uncertainty and hope warring in her expression. "That is something Miss Sullivan and I need to discuss when we have both had time to think. There is no rush. We will figure out what works." Later, after the women had retired to their room and Harrison had moved his essential belongings to the bunkhouse, he stood on the porch and looked up at the stars. The night was clear and cool, and he could hear the cattle lowing in the distance and the yip of coyotes on the far ridge. This was his life, the one he had built through years of hard work and determination. And now, in the span of a few hours, it had been turned upside down by the arrival of two women who brought with them complications and responsibilities he had not fully anticipated. But as he stood there in the darkness, Harrison did not feel regret. Instead, he felt something that might have been hope. The house had felt less empty tonight, warmed by more than just the fire in the hearth. There had been conversation and connection, the kind of human contact he had been missing without fully realizing it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be practical matters to sort out, decisions to make about sleeping arrangements and work divisions, and the question of marriage that hung between him and Rebecca like morning mist. But tonight, Harrison allowed himself to simply feel grateful that they had come, that they had trusted him enough to make this journey. Inside the house, Rebecca helped her mother change into a nightgown and get settled into the narrow bed that took up most of the smaller room. There was barely space for a second person to sleep on the floor, but Rebecca had spread blankets there and made herself as comfortable as possible. It was no worse than some of the accommodations they had endured on the journey west, and far better than the alternatives they had faced in Boston. "He is not what I expected," Martha said softly in the darkness. "What did you expect?" Rebecca asked, though she knew what her mother meant. Harrison was not the grizzled, rough character she had feared might answer a mail-order bride advertisement. He was weathered by sun and work, yes, but there was kindness in his eyes and a gentleness in the way he moved that spoke of a man who was deliberate in his actions. "I do not know," Martha admitted. "Someone harder, perhaps, more desperate. But Mr. Lambert seems like a man who chose to seek a wife, not someone who had no other options. That speaks well of him." Rebecca thought about this as she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Her mother was right. Harrison could have reacted with anger or resentment when he realized she had brought an additional person into their arrangement. Many men would have. But instead, he had responded with grace and acceptance, had made room in his home and his life without hesitation. She found herself remembering the way his hands had looked as he helped her mother from the wagon, strong and capable but infinitely careful. The way he had draped the blanket over Martha's shoulders without making a fuss about it, as if caring for others was simply what one did. In Boston, Rebecca had known men who performed charity like it was a performance, who wanted recognition for every small kindness. Harrison's generosity seemed to come from a different place entirely, something fundamental to his character rather than something he did for show. "Do you think you could love him?" Martha asked, and Rebecca was glad for the darkness that hid her blush. "I do not know him well enough to answer that," Rebecca said honestly, "but I think I could respect him, and perhaps that is a better foundation for a marriage than romantic notions." "Perhaps," Martha agreed, though she sounded doubtful. "But you deserve romance too, my dear. You deserve to be loved, not just respected." Rebecca did not answer, but she found herself hoping that her mother was right. that maybe in this harsh and beautiful land she might find both respect and love, that the arrangement that had begun as a practical solution to desperate circumstances might become something more. The next days fell into a rhythm that surprised all of them with its naturalness. Harrison rose before dawn, as was his habit, and headed out to tend to the cattle and horses. Rebecca woke shortly after, stoking the fire and preparing breakfast with the supplies Harrison had on hand. When he returned, they ate together, the conversation gradually becoming less stilted as they learned each other's patterns and preferences. Martha stayed inside for the most part, her strength not equal to the demands of ranch life, but she kept herself occupied with mending and sewing. Harrison's clothes bore testament to years of bachelor repairs, and she took obvious pleasure in fixing seams and replacing buttons with the skill of a professional seamstress. Rebecca helped with the heavier chores, learning to feed the chickens and collect eggs, to draw water from the well, to hang laundry on the line Harrison strung up between two posts. On the third day, Harrison rode into town and returned with fabric, thread, and a sewing machine that he carried in on his shoulder despite Rebecca's protests that it was too much. "I have been meaning to get one anyway," he said, though Rebecca suspected this was not entirely true. "Figured it would make Mrs. Sullivan's work easier." Martha's eyes had filled with tears when she saw the machine, running her hands over its smooth surface with something like reverence. "I have not had access to a machine since I lost my position at the shop," she said quietly. "This is too generous, Mr. Lambert." "It is an investment," Harrison replied gruffly, embarrassed by her emotion. "You can do repairs for folks in town if you want, extra income for you both." This practical framing seemed to make the gift more acceptable to Martha's pride, and she nodded. Within days, word had spread through Fort Stanton that there was a skilled seamstress at the Lambert ranch, and people began bringing work. Martha's face regained some of its color as she bent over the machine, her fingers remembering old skills and finding purpose again. Rebecca watched the transformation in her mother with gratitude that went beyond words. In Boston, Martha had been fading, worn down by poverty and illness and the grinding hopelessness of their situation. Here, she was coming back to life in small but measurable ways. As for her own role, Rebecca was still figuring out where she fit. She was not Harrison's wife, not technically, though they lived under the same roof and shared meals and conversation. The question of marriage hung between them, unspoken but present in every interaction. Harrison had not pressed the matter, had not demanded an answer or set a timeline. Rebecca appreciated his patience, but she also felt the weight of uncertainty. What were they building here? What did he expect from her? The answer began to reveal itself in increments. Harrison was teaching her about the ranch, explaining the cattle business and the challenges of making a living from this hard land. He showed her how to ride one of the gentler horses, steadying her when she wobbled in the saddle and praising her when she managed a complete circuit of the corral without assistance. He consulted her about practical matters, asking her opinion on everything from what supplies to buy in town to where to plant a vegetable garden come spring. He treated her, Rebecca realized, like a partner. Not like a servant or an obligation, but like someone whose thoughts and contributions mattered. It was a novel experience for a woman who had spent most of her adult life being told what to do and how to do it. 2 weeks after her arrival, Rebecca was working in the kitchen when Harrison came in from the fields earlier than usual. His shirt was dusty and his hair was disheveled, and there was something in his expression that made her set down the spoon she had been using to stir stew. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Harrison removed his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign that he was working up to saying something difficult. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "About us." Rebecca's heart began to beat faster. She glanced toward the bedroom where Martha was napping, grateful for the relative privacy. "All right," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and sitting down at the table. Harrison sat across from her, and for a moment he just looked at her in a way that made her feel seen down to her bones. "I have been thinking about our arrangement," he began, "about what makes sense for everyone involved, and I think we need to be honest with each other about what we want this to be." "I agree," Rebecca said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "When I put that advertisement in the paper, I was looking for a wife," Harrison continued. "Not just someone to cook and clean, but a true partner. Someone to build a life with, to share the good and the bad. Someone to talk to in the evenings and wake up next to in the mornings. Maybe, eventually, someone to raise children with." Rebecca nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "But I also know that wanting something and having it just happen are two different things," Harrison said. "You came here out of necessity, not because you knew me and chose me. And you have your mother to think about, responsibilities that go beyond just your own happiness. I do not want you to feel pressured into anything. If you would rather keep things as they are, you living here and helping with the ranch but us staying separate, I can accept that. You and your mother will have a home here regardless." The generosity of this offer, the sheer decency of it, made Rebecca's eyes burn with unshed tears. How many men would make such a promise? How many would be content with an arrangement that gave them all the responsibility of housing and feeding two women without any of the traditional benefits of marriage? "What do you want?" Rebecca asked, needing to hear him say it clearly. Harrison met her eyes directly. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want us to take the time to get to know each other without the pressure of expectations hanging over us. And if, at the end of that time, you think you could be happy as my wife, then I would be honored to marry you. But if not, the offer of a home still stands." Rebecca felt something unfurl in her chest, something warm and bright that she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Hope, she recognized. Real, genuine hope for a future that might hold not just security but happiness. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like to be courted, Mr. Lambert, to get to know you better. You have been nothing but kind and generous since we arrived, but you are right that we are still strangers in many ways. I want to change that." The smile that spread across Harrison's face transformed him, making him look younger and lighter. "Then that is what we will do," he said. "And Rebecca, maybe you could call me Harrison. I think we are past the point of such formality." "Harrison," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "And you should call me Rebecca." "Rebecca," he said, and the way he said her name, like it was something precious, made her blush. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Rebecca had experienced in Boston. There were no formal dances or carefully supervised parlor visits. Instead, there were rides across the ranch with Harrison pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the land. There were evenings on the porch watching the sunset while Martha sat inside with her sewing, giving them privacy without making them feel like they were doing something improper. There were conversations about everything and nothing, the kind of deep talks that revealed the fundamental nature of a person. Rebecca learned that Harrison had come to New Mexico from Kansas, that his father had been a farmer who drank too much and his mother a quiet woman who had died young. That he had left home at 16, worked as a ranch hand for years, and saved every penny until he could afford to buy his own land. That he valued honesty above all else, and believed that a person's word was the measure of their character. Harrison learned that Rebecca loved teaching, that she missed it more than she had admitted even to herself. That her father had been a scholar who had fallen from grace due to his radical ideas about education and social reform, and that his idealism had left his family impoverished after his death. That Rebecca had inherited both his passion for learning and his stubborn insistence on doing what was right even when it was not easy. They discovered shared values and complementary differences. Harrison was steady and practical, where Rebecca was passionate and idealistic. She pushed him to think beyond the immediate needs of the ranch, to consider what legacy he wanted to build. He grounded her, reminding her that dreams required foundations and that there was honor in the simple work of daily survival. Martha watched their courtship with satisfaction, her health improving steadily as the clean air and good food and sense of purpose worked their magic. She said little about what she observed, but Rebecca often caught her smiling to herself as she sewed, and there was a contentment in her mother's face that had been absent for years. One October evening, when the air had turned crisp and the first hints of winter were showing in the mountains, Harrison took Rebecca for a ride to a spot he called the Overlook. It was a high point on his property where you could see for miles in every direction. The land spread out below them like a patchwork quilt of browns and golds and the deep green of juniper. They sat on a flat rock, their horses grazing nearby, and watched as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink and purple that took Rebecca's breath away. Harrison had brought a blanket, and he draped it over her shoulders as the temperature dropped, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "I love it here," Rebecca said, and she meant it. The landscape that had seemed so harsh and alien when she first arrived had revealed its beauty to her in countless small ways. The resilience of the plants that thrived in difficult soil, the vast expanse of sky that made her feel simultaneously tiny and part of something infinite, the silence that was not empty but full of wind and bird song and the subtle sounds of life persisting against odds. "I am glad," Harrison said quietly, "because I have been thinking and I need to ask you something important." Rebecca turned to look at him, her heart beginning to race. In the golden light of the dying sun, Harrison's face was all plains and shadows, handsome in a rugged way that had nothing to do with classical beauty and everything to do with strength of character. "We have been dancing around this for weeks now," Harrison continued. "Getting to know each other, building something between us. And I think you know how I feel about you, Rebecca. But I need to say it out loud. I have fallen in love with you, not because you are convenient or because you are here, but because of who you are. Your strength and your kindness, and the way you see possibilities where others see only obstacles. I love the way you treat your mother and the way you have taken to ranch life, even though it is nothing like what you are used to. I love talking with you and working beside you and imagining a future where we do this for the rest of our lives." Rebecca felt tears slide down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "Harrison," she whispered. "So I am asking you, properly and formally, if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife," Harrison said. "Not because of some arrangement made through letters, but because we have chosen each other, because we want to build a life together." "Yes," Rebecca said, the word coming out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, I will marry you, because I have fallen in love with you too, with your patience and your generosity and the way you made room in your life for both me and my mother without hesitation. With the way you see value in things that others overlook, with your quiet strength and your terrible jokes, and the way you look at me like I am something precious." Harrison pulled her into his arms, and Rebecca went willingly, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced before. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, almost questioning, and then deeper as she responded. It was a kiss full of promise and passion and the sweet relief of two people who had found each other against all odds. They rode back to the ranch as the stars were coming out, and when they walked into the house hand in hand, Martha took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "About time," she said, setting down her sewing. "I was beginning to think you two would never get around to it." Harrison laughed, a sound of pure joy that Rebecca had never heard from him before. "We will marry as soon as it can be arranged," he announced. "If that meets with your approval, Mrs. Sullivan." "My approval was given the day you met us at that stagecoach and did not turn us away," Martha said. "You are a good man, Harrison Lambert. My daughter is lucky to have you, though I suspect you are pretty lucky too." "The luckiest man alive," Harrison agreed, looking at Rebecca with such open affection that she felt her cheeks warm. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Fort Stanton. Rebecca wore a dress that Martha had made from the fabric Harrison had bought, pale blue with delicate embroidery that had taken her mother hours to complete. Harrison wore new clothes purchased specifically for the occasion, looking uncomfortable but handsome in the unfamiliar formality. The whole town turned out for the wedding, curious about the mail-order bride who had arrived with her elderly mother, and somehow captured the heart of one of the area's most eligible bachelors. Rebecca stood at the front of the church with Harrison's hand warm and steady in hers, and when Reverend Morris asked if she took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, she said, "I do," with a conviction that rang through the small space. Harrison's voice was equally firm when he made his vows, and when he kissed her at the Reverend's instruction, there were genuine smiles and scattered applause from the assembled witnesses. Whatever doubts or judgments people might have harbored about their unconventional beginning seemed to melt away in the face of the obvious love between them. The celebration that followed was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and drink and making a party of it. Martha presided over everything from a chair Harrison had positioned in the shade, accepting congratulations and well wishes with the grace of a woman who had raised a daughter to be proud of. Rebecca danced with Harrison in the space between the house and the barn, laughing as he apologized for his lack of skill and stepped on her toes. "I do not care if you are the worst dancer in New Mexico," Rebecca told him, her arms around his neck and her face tilted up to his. "As long as you keep looking at me like that." "Like what?" Harrison asked, though the smile tugging at his mouth suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "Like I am home," Rebecca said softly. "You are home," Harrison replied and kissed her again to the hoots and hollers of their guests. That night, after the last of the well-wishers had departed and Martha had retired to her room with pointed commentary about being a heavy sleeper, Harrison and Rebecca stood together on the porch. The main bedroom was theirs now properly, and Rebecca felt nervous butterflies in her stomach, despite the desire that had been building between them for weeks. Harrison seemed to sense her nervousness. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "We do not have to rush anything," he said quietly. "This is our life now, we have all the time in the world," but Rebecca shook her head, stepping closer to him. "I am not afraid," she said. "Not of this, not of you, I trust you, Harrison." The way his eyes darkened with desire and love made her feel powerful and feminine in a way that was entirely new. When he picked her up and carried her across the threshold into their bedroom, Rebecca laughed with pure happiness, burying her face in his shoulder and breathing in the scent of him that had become so familiar. Soap and leather and sunshine, mixed with something that was uniquely Harrison. He set her down gently beside the bed, and what followed was tender and awkward and wonderful in the way of first times between people who loved each other. Harrison was patient and careful, and Rebecca was grateful for the marriage manuals she had read in secret back in Boston, the ones that had given her some idea of what to expect. But nothing had prepared her for the emotional intimacy of it, the vulnerability and trust required to give yourself to another person so completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Rebecca felt contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. Harrison's hand traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she could hear his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Harrison replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for choosing me, for taking a chance on this life." "Thank you for making room for both of us," Rebecca said, "for not turning us away, for being exactly who you are." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first year of their marriage unfolded with its share of joys and difficulties. Winter came hard to the New Mexico territory that year, with snowstorms that trapped them in the house for days at a time. But the forced proximity only deepened their bond, and they passed the long evenings with conversation and reading aloud and teaching Martha to play card games that Harrison knew. When spring arrived, Rebecca planted the vegetable garden they had discussed, working the soil with a determination that amused and impressed Harrison in equal measure. She had never gardened in her life, but she approached it with the same intensity she had brought to teaching, reading every book on the subject she could get her hands from the small library in Fort Stanton, and experimenting with different techniques. The garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables that improved their diet considerably. Martha canned and preserved everything they did not eat fresh, and by the end of summer, the shelves in the small root cellar Harrison had dug were lined with jars that glowed like jewels in the dim light. Rebecca also began teaching again, in an informal way. Word spread that the new Mrs. Lambert had been a teacher back east, and parents began approaching her about tutoring their children. Harrison helped her convert part of the barn into a small schoolroom, and twice a week Rebecca held classes for the handful of children whose families could spare them from farm work. She refused to charge for her teaching, much to Harrison's amusement and exasperation. "You should be compensated for your time," he argued. "They pay me in other ways," Rebecca countered. "Fresh eggs and milk and sometimes help with the heavy chores. That is worth more than money to me. Besides, these children need education, Harrison. It is not right that they should go without just because their families are struggling." It was her father's idealism coming through, that stubborn insistence on doing what was right regardless of practicality. Harrison found he could not argue with it, especially when he saw how alive Rebecca became when she was teaching, how her whole face lit up as she worked with her students. Martha's health continued to improve throughout that first year, though she would never be truly well again. The heart condition that had prompted their flight from Boston was chronic and incurable, but the better living conditions and sense of purpose seemed to slow its progression. She became a fixture in the community, the skilled seamstress at the Lambert ranch who could fix anything and whose prices were always fair. In late summer, Rebecca realized she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with a complicated mix of joy and fear. She had seen women die in childbirth, knew the risks that every pregnancy carried, especially out here where doctors were scarce and medical care primitive by Boston standards. But when she told Harrison, his reaction dispelled her fears like morning fog under the sun. He had been mucking out stalls when she found him, and he dropped the pitchfork immediately, pulling her into his arms despite being covered in dirt and hay. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice shaking with emotion. "As sure as I can be," Rebecca confirmed. I have missed 2 cycles now, and I have been sick in the mornings. All the signs point to it." Harrison held her at arm's length, his hands on her shoulders, and looked at her with such awe and love that Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "You are going to be a mother." "And you are going to be a father," Rebecca replied, laughing through her tears. Martha was equally overjoyed by the news, already planning all the tiny garments she would sew. The pregnancy progressed normally, though the morning sickness was worse than Rebecca had expected, and the summer heat made her constantly uncomfortable. Harrison became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work and fretting whenever she so much as stumbled. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Rebecca told him after he had insisted for the 3rd time that she should not be carrying water buckets. "I know that," Harrison said defensively. "But I also know that carrying a child takes a toll on a woman's body, and I will not have you wearing yourself out when I am perfectly capable of doing the heavy work." Rebecca softened at his concern, recognizing it for the love it was. "All right," she said. "I will let you do the heavy lifting." "But I am not going to stop living my life, Harrison. I am not an invalid." They found a balance, as they had learned to do with all aspects of their marriage. Rebecca continued teaching her small class until her pregnancy became too obvious to hide, though several of the mothers gently suggested she should retire from such activities once she began showing. Rebecca ignored these suggestions, figuring that children should know that pregnant women were perfectly capable of functioning normally. In March of 1880, when the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to bud with new life, Rebecca went into labor. Harrison had arranged for a midwife from town to come stay at the ranch for the last 2 weeks of Rebecca's pregnancy, a weathered woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. When the contractions started, Mrs. Chen shooed Harrison out of the room with instructions to boil water and stay out of the way. Martha held Rebecca's hand through the long hours of labor, offering encouragement and cool cloths for her forehead. The pain was worse than anything Rebecca had imagined, waves of agony that seemed to go on forever, but she gritted her teeth and bore it, focusing on the prize that waited at the end. Harrison paced outside like a caged animal, wearing a path in the dirt as he walked back and forth. He could hear Rebecca's cries through the walls, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He had never felt so helpless in his life, unable to do anything to ease her suffering. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, thin and wailing and perfect, Harrison sagged against the wall in relief. Mrs. Chen emerged a few minutes later, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs. Mother and baby are both doing well." Harrison did not remember moving, but suddenly he was in the bedroom, kneeling beside the bed where Rebecca lay exhausted but radiant. She held a tiny bundle in her arms, and when she looked up at Harrison, her eyes were shining with tears and triumph. "Look," she whispered. "Look at what we made." Harrison looked down at his son, at the impossibly small face scrunched up in displeasure at being thrust into the cold world. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect fingers that were curled into fists. As Harrison watched, one of those miniature hands reached out blindly, and without thinking, Harrison offered his finger. The baby's grip was surprisingly strong, and Harrison felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. "He is perfect," Harrison said hoarsely. "You are perfect." "Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for this gift." They named him Henry Marcus Lambert after both their fathers, though they called him Henry from the start. He was a good baby, healthy and alert, and he transformed their lives in ways both expected and surprising. The house that had once seemed adequately sized suddenly felt cramped with a cradle in the bedroom and drying diapers hung everywhere. The nights were broken by feedings and changings, and Rebecca walked through the days in a fog of exhausted love. Harrison proved to be a devoted father, taking his turns walking the floor with a fussy baby and changing diapers without complaint. He fashioned a cradle board like the ones the Apache mothers used, allowing Rebecca to keep Henry close while she worked. The sight of her husband, this strong, capable rancher, cradling their tiny son with such gentleness, never failed to make Rebecca's heart swell with love. Martha was besotted with her grandson, spending hours rocking him and singing old lullabies that Rebecca remembered from her own childhood. The baby seemed to recognize his grandmother's voice, settling immediately when she took him in her arms. It gave Martha a new purpose, this grandmothering, and her face carried a contentment that spoke of a life well lived. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Harrison's herd increased, and he hired on 2 permanent hands to help with the expanding operation. Rebecca's informal school grew as well, until she was teaching nearly a dozen children on a regular basis. Harrison built her a proper schoolhouse, a small building near the main house with benches and a chalkboard and shelves for the books that Rebecca accumulated through trades and purchases. On Henry's 3rd birthday, as they celebrated with cake that Martha had baked and presents that Harrison had made with his own hands, Rebecca watched her family and felt a peace so profound it almost frightened her. This was not the life she had imagined for herself back in Boston, struggling to survive in a boarding house and caring for her dying mother. This was so much more than she had dared to dream. "What are you thinking about?" Harrison asked, coming to stand beside her. Henry was playing in the dirt with the toy horses his father had carved, and Martha was watching him with a grandmother's indulgent eye. "About how lucky we are," Rebecca said. "About how none of this would have happened if you had not been exactly who you are. If you had turned us away that first day, or if you had resented Mama's presence, or if you had been any less kind than you have been." Harrison pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am the lucky one," he said. "You gave me a family, Rebecca. A real home. Before you came, this was just a place I lived. You made it something more." They stood like that for a long moment, watching their son play and Martha smile, and the sun sink toward the horizon in one of those spectacular New Mexico sunsets that still took Rebecca's breath away. The land around them was harsh and demanding, but it had given them space to become the people they were meant to be. It had tested them and shaped them, and ultimately blessed them with a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. 2 years later, Rebecca gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Robert and Ruth. The delivery was harder than Henry's had been, and there were moments when even Mrs. Chen looked worried, but Rebecca fought through with the same determination she brought to everything. When it was over, she lay exhausted in bed with a baby in each arm and tears streaming down her face. "We are going to need a bigger house," Harrison said, looking somewhat dazed as he surveyed his suddenly expanded family. "We are," Rebecca agreed, laughing through her exhaustion. "And possibly more help. I do not think I can teach and manage 3 small children at the same time." They hired a young woman from town named Sarah to help with the children and the household work. Harrison built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch continued to grow, becoming one of the most successful operations in the area, and Harrison's reputation as a fair and honest man made him a respected figure in Fort Stanton. Rebecca's school became a permanent institution, with the community building a larger schoolhouse and eventually agreeing to pay her a small salary for her work. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic, but also history and geography and the natural sciences that she loved. Her students went on to become teachers and businesspeople and ranchers in their own right, and they always credited Mrs. Lambert with giving them the foundation for their success. Martha lived to see all three of her grandchildren grow past toddlerhood, her heart finally giving out peacefully in her sleep when she was 74 years old. They buried her on a rise overlooking the ranch, in a spot she had always loved for its view of the mountains. Rebecca grieved deeply, but there was comfort in knowing that her mother had spent her final years in happiness and purpose, surrounded by family who loved her. She got to start over, Rebecca said at the funeral, standing between Harrison and Henry, who was now 8 and trying to be brave. She got to build a new life here, one that was full of joy instead of struggle. That is all any of us can hope for. The years continued to unfold, bringing the normal mix of triumphs and sorrows that make up a life. There were hard winters and drought summers, cattle lost to disease and crops that failed. There were injuries and illnesses, close calls that left Harrison and Rebecca clinging to each other in relief. But there were also first days of school and birthday celebrations, holidays spent with friends and neighbors, quiet evenings on the porch watching their children play. Henry grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, while Robert was more interested in books and learning. Ruth was a perfect blend of both her parents, practical and idealistic in equal measure, with her mother's passion for teaching and her father's steady determination. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Harrison took Rebecca back to the overlook where he had proposed. They were older now, marked by 2 decades of hard work and sun and the inevitable passage of time. Harrison's hair was streaked with gray and Rebecca's hands bore calluses from years of labor. But when they looked at each other, they saw not just what was but all that had been, the accumulation of 20 years of shared experiences and grown love. "I would do it all again," Rebecca said, sitting on the same rock where they had sat so many years before. "Every hard moment, every challenge. It was all worth it to end up here with you. Even the part where you showed up with your mother and I did not know what I was getting into," Harrison teased. "Especially that part," Rebecca said seriously, "because that is when I knew who you really were. Not when you wrote pretty letters or made promises from a distance, but when you were faced with a situation you had not expected and chose kindness anyway. That is when I started to fall in love with you, Harrison. That very first day." Harrison pulled her close, and they sat together watching the sun set just as they had 2 decades earlier. The land spread out below them was dotted with their cattle, and they could see the ranch house in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where their children were probably helping Sarah prepare dinner. It was a good life, hard-earned and precious, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine love. "My home has room for both," Harrison said softly, echoing the words that had changed everything. "Best decision I ever made." "Best decision we both made," Rebecca corrected, and kissed him as the sky turned gold and pink and purple, painting them in light. The years that followed were kinder than either of them had any right to expect. Henry took over more and more of the ranch operations, as Harrison's joints began to protest the long hours and hard work. Robert went east to college, earning a degree in law and returning to open a practice in Fort Stanton. Ruth followed in her mother's footsteps, taking over the school when Rebecca finally admitted that she was ready to retire. Harrison and Rebecca grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing like good wine. They became the couple that younger people pointed to as an example, the mail-order bride and the cowboy who had built something beautiful out of an uncertain beginning. They were grandparents and then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading and branching until they could barely keep track of all their descendants. On a spring morning in 1920, when Rebecca was 67 and Harrison was 72, they sat together on the porch of the house they had expanded and renovated so many times over the decades. Rebecca was knitting a blanket for their latest great-grandchild, and Harrison was whittling a toy horse in the style that had become his signature. The cottonwoods along the creek were in full bloom, and the air was sweet with their scent. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston? Giving up the life you might have had?" Rebecca set down her knitting and looked at him with the patience of someone who had answered this question before in various forms. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This is the life I was meant to have. You are the man I was meant to love. If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a thing except maybe to hurry that stage coach along so I could get here faster." Harrison laughed, the sound rich and full of the joy that had characterized their decades together. "Good," he said, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You and your mother, showing up that day and turning everything upside down. Best thing that ever happened to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that comes only with deep familiarity and abiding love. In the distance, they could hear their great-grandson playing, his laughter carried on the breeze. The ranch was thriving under Henry's management. The school Ruth ran was educating its third generation of students, and Robert's law practice was helping to bring order and justice to a territory that had once been wild and lawless. Everything they had built, everything they had worked for, was bearing fruit in ways they could never have imagined on that dusty September day 42 years earlier, when Rebecca and Martha had stepped off the stagecoach into an uncertain future. "I love you," Rebecca said, reaching over to take Harrison's hand. His skin was weathered and spotted with age, but his grip was still strong, still steady. "I love you too," Harrison replied. "Always have, always will." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the porch and the two people who sat there, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperation that had driven her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. The fear she had felt bringing her sick mother along. The overwhelming relief when Harrison had said those simple, profound words, "My home has room for both." Those words had opened up a world of possibilities, had given her and Martha a chance to start over, to build new lives in a place that valued what you could do over who your family had been. Harrison's generosity had been the seed from which everything else had grown, their love and their family, and the legacy they would leave behind. The story that had begun with uncertainty and necessity had become something far more precious. It had become a love story, yes, but also a story about second chances and the power of kindness, about how opening your home and your heart to someone in need could transform not just their life but your own, about how the greatest risks often brought the greatest rewards. Rebecca squeezed Harrison's hand, and he squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was contained everything they had been to each other over 4 decades. Partners and lovers, friends and confidants, the foundation on which each other's lives had been built. The mail-order bride and the cowboy who had said, "My home has room for both," had created something that would last far beyond their own years. They had created a family, a legacy, a love that would echo through generations. And as they sat together on that sun-warmed porch, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the love they had nurtured, both of them knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together. Always together. In the home they had built with their own hands and filled with their love, on the harsh and beautiful land that had tested them and blessed them in equal measure. This was their happily ever after, earned through years of hard work and unwavering commitment to each other, and the vows they had made in that little church in Fort Stanton. The story that had started with a stagecoach arrival and a simple act of kindness had become the foundation of a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And neither Rebecca nor Harrison would have had it any other way.